G'day, Professor Joseph Drew here. I'm here to talk about perhaps the most powerful tool you have to communicate the intricacies of local government finance and economics to your residents. And it's absolutely critical that they understand how local government finance works, understand how government finance works. Because if they don't, they will labour under fiscal illusion, not understand the situation you're in, and demand more than what they're willing to pay for. And of course, that ends in financial disaster. So the personal budget metaphor is a metaphor. Like all metaphors, it allows us to take something that we know in order to understand something that we don't know so well. And they're not exactly identical. That's why they're called metaphors instead of identicals. But they do allow us to bridge the gap. Now, most people understand how a personal budget ought to be used and employed. So if we draw on their everyday experience, they should be able to make the jump up to understanding how local government and government budgets ought to work. So most people understand that we must balance our personal budgets. We must have sufficient revenue coming in to meet our expenses. And as President Roosevelt famously said, we all know that we can spend more in 1 year than we earn. But we also all know that if we do that for too many years, it will inevitably end up with us in the poorhouse. Now, they were the days when if you couldn't pay your debt or your property was seized and you were thrown into a communal living house where you had to work until you could pay off your debts. So they were pretty scary times, and being in the situation where you were consistently spending more than your revenue was obviously going to land you in a mess. Well, it's exactly the same for local government. If we consistently spend more than we earn, ultimately there must be a reckoning. People don't like me talking about a day of reckoning. It's too scary apparently, but it's just reality. Just like it is in your personal budget, you can't consistently spend significantly more every year than you earn and not expect to have a reckoning, not expect to have a crisis down the track. Debt and personal budgets. Most people understand that when you take out debt, it should be for something enduring, something that lasts a long time, like a house or a car. It ought not be for holidays. I know a lot of people do take out debt for holidays. Back when I was a banking executive, we never used to lend for purposes like that, because after the holiday, no one wants to repay their debt because they regret borrowing money, bringing forward future income in order to have a temporary and fleeting happiness experience. It's much better to lend for enduring assets. Also, in our personal budgets, we expect to make the repayment straight away as soon as we borrow the money, and we expect to personally have to repay all the money. Now, unfortunately, in local government and all tiers of government, the federal government's the worst villain in this one. Unfortunately, a lot of government debt, the repayments don't start immediately. They don't come from some sort of sacrifice. And the sacrifice is you either cut spending elsewhere or you earn more money, just like you did when you bought your first house, no doubt, like I had to do. I took out a second job and I cut my household expenditure incredibly in order to make the repayments. That's the normal thing. It doesn't happen when governments take out debt. Our federal government's taken up $1 trillion of debt or so. Where has the sacrifice been? I don't recall paying extra taxes. I don't recall seeing government spending cut. It hasn't happened. It often doesn't happen at the local government level either. And it's actually more serious because at the local government level we can't monetize debt. As I said, debt should be for enduring assets, but often it's not. You know, we just took out some debt to buy submarines that we're not going to get. We took out debt to put flags on bridges that aren't going to be enduring. They're going to be fleeting happiness when the flag first goes up, and then people will quickly forget about it. We took out debt, an awful lot of debt, to hand out free cash to people during COVID. That's not enduring assets. And debt should be paid for by the people who take it out. You know, you would never take out debt and expect someone else to pay off your loan. I wouldn't take out a big loan, expect to leave it in my will to my children to pay off that loan when I die. That'd just be wrong and morally reprehensible, but we do it all the time in our government finances. As I say, we've racked up $1 trillion or so or more of debt at the federal level, not to mention what the states have been doing, and local governments have been racking up considerably less debt, but they have been racking up debt. Now, government's different to the personal situation because you can actually force the next generation that hasn't even been born to pay the debt. And that's what economists talk about as being a great moral hazard, because we know that the human temptation will be to spend up and enjoy things and push this debt onto other people because we can. They've got no voice. Some of them haven't even been born yet, and we're going to push the debt onto them. But we ought to have virtue, and we ought to recognize that that's very morally bad and go out of our way to avoid it. We don't do so. We should do so. In our personal budgets, we plan for asset replacement. I do anyway. I put money aside every fortnight in my pay for tyres for my car and ultimately for a new car and to pay bills. I know some people don't. I think I'm married to someone who doesn't put money away for these sorts of things. But that's the responsible way to run a personal budget. And if you do that, you never end up in a crisis. When my car is dead and about to be buried, like this one on the screen, the money will be sitting there. Now, in a local government sense, we don't really do that. We do put money into something called reserves. And that's money that we put away for things that we need to replace. We should have reserves for infrastructure replacement, for plant and equipment replacement to replace tractors and trucks and things like that. Some councils do, some councils don't. They ought to be doing it. It's also sort of accounted for in what's called depreciation. It appears on the income statement. Now, depreciation is a measure of the consumption, the value of consumption of a long-lived asset. So if I have a tractor, it's worth $100,000. I think it lasts for 10 years. In straight line, linear depreciation, every year on the income statement, I would have a depreciation expense for $10,000, 1/10 of the value of that tractor. Now, if I'm recording surpluses and I'm also putting that money away in an internal reserve, what it means is that at the end of the life of that tractor, the money will be there to replace it. Now, unfortunately, a lot of councils don't have surpluses, aren't putting the depreciation or the value of the depreciation away in an internal reserve and won't have the money to replace the asset. Now, that is what when they don't do these things, is what we refer to as an implicit debt. It's every bit as bad as a bank debt, and it's every bit as bad morally as leaving a whopping great big debt for our children and our grandchildren to pay off. Now, I will do a video just on depreciation. It's much more complicated than what I've just said, but I'm trying not to get bogged down in detail because I want to move all the way through this personal budget metaphor for you. And all of this is important because there's this brilliant technique that was made very popular by a sage of all things, Kiva. And it was called Kalvahamma. It's Hebrew for heavy and light. And basically what it says is what we do in small things, we should do even more than that in more important and critical things. Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, used to say something like that: I run my government like I run my personal kitchen budget. And it's true. If it's good enough for me to put money away to replace my car ultimately in a small thing like my personal finances and my finances for my farm, surely I'd have to do the same thing in a much bigger thing like my federal government, state government or local government. If it's good enough to only ever take out debt for reasonable things like houses and cars, and to accept the fact that of course I'd have to pay off the debt that I've taken out for the thing I got, surely in a much more important thing like government, we would have to do that. That's Kalvahamma at work. So when you're talking to residents about local government finances, try to relate it back to personal budgets. Most people do understand how a personal budget ought to be run, and try to invoke this very powerful rhetorical device called Kalvahamma. Surely if we do these things in small things, our personal budget, surely we must be compelled to do them in much larger, much more important things where people are very vulnerable, particularly the next generation who don't have a voice. The next generation of taxpayers who haven't been born yet will be asked to pay off the trillions of dollars of debt that we've racked up. Not just the explicit debt, also that implicit debt I talked about. So thank you very much for your time. If this video has been helpful, please do me a couple of favours. I'm a little bit frustrated we can't get councillors and council executive to watch these videos. It's so important we get this dialogue happening. I don't have all the answers, but I can start conversations and get you thinking about things in different ways. Local government has the biggest challenge ahead of it in a generation, probably in several generations, and people still don't quite realise that. And if we're going to meet this generational challenge, we're going to need good and reliable information. We're going to need robust conversations. And the starting point is to get people to watch these videos. So if you know another councillor or another senior management or council staff or even resident in another local government area that's probably not watching these videos, flick it on to them. If you can subscribe, do subscribe. It helps me to defend the time I spend on this channel to people who don't always want information out there in an accessible way. And if this video can help anyone in any way, shape or form, it's under my own personal brand and copyright. Do with it as you please. Feel free to pop up on the website or use it for training or whatever. Thank you very much for your time. Goodbye.